Hi, I'm Amber.
And I'm Jessie.
And this is Glowing in Tech. Sponsored by Makers.
So today we have the lovely Simo joining us. And would you be able to introduce yourself and let us know a little bit about you?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Simo. I'm a software engineering coach at Makers, which is a bootcamp for learning how to code. And I've been there for 2 years. Before that, I was a software engineer for around 10, well, I guess in total 10 years, maybe I've been a software engineer. And yeah, that's me.
Awesome. And where are some of the places that you worked at before?
I started at Google, then I moved to London and started at a company called Memrise, which is a language learning app.
Yes.
Yeah. And then I went to Makers.
Amazing. That's like a broad variety of different companies, and also interesting that now you've done your 10 years and you're not only a software engineer, but you're teaching as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that's amazing.
That's amazing. And that leads me nicely to the industry insights in 5. So can you tell us a bit about Makers, what you do there?
Sure, yeah. So apparently, I think Makers is the oldest coding bootcamp in the UK.
Fun
the
facts.
First one.
Yeah.
It's nowadays it has a standard bootcamp model where you can go for like 16 weeks and then we help you find a job afterwards. But also we do apprenticeships, so that's where I mainly work. I work with apprentices, so they're already hired by a company to do a full apprenticeship, which in total takes like 18 months or 2 years or something like that. But I'm with them at the beginning where they are learning. We just basically do the boot camp with them. Then we send them on to their employers and we still help them while they're there. So it's quite varied, I guess. The day to day is very varied because we get so many students through and they change. You know, we have many cohorts at the same time and you kind of get to meet a lot of different people and meet them at different points in the journey and help them grow their career, I guess, or change careers. Mostly it's career changers. So yeah, it's been a cool experience.
Yeah, and a big change as well. I want to know why you ended up at Makers and what was it that made you change from working at like a product-based company to a kind of bootcamp company? Yeah,
it wasn't really a plan, I guess. I just at Memrise I got a bit stuck, frustrated. I was a senior software engineer, but then I wasn't really quite sure. I knew I wanted to grow and do different things from what I was doing, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But Memrise at the time also didn't really have that many other opportunities, but also I wasn't sure I wanted to be a manager or what the other things are, you know. Once you keep, the work starts to repeat itself, and you kind of want to do something new, but I wasn't sure how to get there. So I took some time off, basically. I left Memrise during the pandemic. And I was off work for like 6 months. Which was actually quite nice.
Wait, so at what time was this though? Was this actually like lockdown?
Yeah. Because I'd been planning on leaving, then the pandemic came. I guess, I'd been planning on leaving. Then beginning of 2020, that whole lockdown stuff started. And I was like, well, but I still want to leave and I still don't know what to do next. So I still want to have a break. My plan was actually I wanted to go visit family in Cameroon and things like that, which obviously I couldn't do then. But I kind of liked it. I mean, I guess I'm one of the people that enjoyed lockdown. I kind of liked the peace of it. So it wasn't too bad, actually. And I had a lot of time to, I guess, just figure out what I like and what I don't like, and got into new hobbies and things like that. And then I started looking around. At some point I was like, I need some kind of structure again. I want to do something again, but I still didn't feel like I wanted to get another software engineer job. So, but I knew that I'd always sort of enjoyed mentoring when I was engineer at Memrise. I always
the M's.
Yeah, and so I thought, well, maybe I can do something in that direction. And that's how I came across makers.
Okay, nice.
I kind of just Googled for mentoring opportunities. I was thinking at first like, oh, maybe there's some, those kind of entrepreneurship accelerator things where I could mentor more like a side thing until I figure out what I really want to do. But then there was that, and I'd also had some kind of very different experience of teaching because I'd done yoga teacher training and I taught yoga for a bit before.
Oh, that's amazing.
That's really cool.
Yeah. Like when I was at Memrise, actually, I taught my colleagues.
Oh,
What? You're doing yoga courses while you were like,
Yeah.
oh, that's so cool.
That's really nice.
Yeah, because I'd done yoga teacher training before I joined Memrise. And then I just kind of did it out of interest, not really because I wanted to be a teacher. But then while we were there, obviously we had to practice teaching. And I was like, this is actually kind of fun. Maybe I could do it more. And and I asked at Memrise, can I, do this? And there was some space in the office. So just after work, I kind of taught people.
That's really cool. So at what point, so you are taking some time out during the pandemic and you were reflecting, you kind of enjoying your break, and then you found Makers. What made you say that I want to now be a technical coach? What was that experience like?
I guess I applied to Makers. I applied to another place as well, which was also a coach kind of thing. And I didn't know. I was just kind of like, well, it sounds kind of like it could be fun, and it sounds a bit like me. Now I remember another thing. I think at the time during my time off, I was also thinking maybe I should be a therapist.
Ooh.
And so I'd done this like intro to counseling short course thing, and then the Makers kind of job ad had a lot about like, I guess part of coaching is sort of empathy, things like the interpersonal, not just the
Absolutely,
technical.
yeah.
And so I thought, well, actually, maybe I don't want to. I'm not sure I actually want to be a therapist right now. But then I do find that people tell me I'm good at the interpersonal things, so maybe I can sort of. This seems like I can put these things together, or like, I can at least try and see what I would like to do. Still be in the sort of technical space, but also explore a different side of myself, I guess.
Yeah, I think really cool. I think it speaks to the importance of taking that career break, because you were clearly like aware that what you were doing at Memrise wasn't fulfilling for you and you needed a change, but not quite sure what the next step was. So I think it's really cool that you had that time to think about it. You had a pause, and like you were able to find something that now you really enjoy, right?
Yeah, especially as a technical coach. Like, what new like skills have you learned since doing that role?
Probably a lot about I mean, it sounds kind of dry, but like dealing with conflict. I'm not the most I think I'm still working. I was working on being more assertive, but I've definitely had to learn that a lot more, because at first, I guess students you need to give them feedback, but also because you're training adults, it's not like you're just saying like go do this and then everyone will do it. Like they have to work in teams sometimes. That always leads to people always
not getting along,
have friction, things like that, which is quite normal also because they don't know how to work in a software engineering team. That's what they're supposed to learn. So there's all these like conflicts about like, I don't know, how do we break up these tasks so that everyone feels like they have something interesting to do, and this person is forging ahead while the others feel left behind, or vice versa, whatever, things like that. And I guess so often it's things like that. It's like conflict between students maybe, but you need to sort of facilitate a discussion between them, or sort of find a way to to make their experience better and keep them on a learning track rather than like kind of into this sort of place where I guess everyone's anxious and stressed and doesn't learn.
Yeah, because it needs to be engaging, comforting, comfortable, as well as pushing their boundaries, because you're teaching people a very difficult to learn skill and they're doing it starting from zero. Like it must be really tricky to navigate that sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, it's the cool thing is that Makers has alongside the technical curriculum, there's this emotional intelligence curriculum as well, and that's delivered by other coaches, but it's sort of runs at the same time, so the students have to do that part too, where they learn more about like empathy, communication, group work, things like that. So that's like kind of supportive, because you're not starting, you have something to refer to.
Yes, exactly.
And they have something to refer to, because it is kind of difficult. Like, I guess that's one of the difficult things with this coaching, is that you do a lot of things at once, like the technical stuff, but then sometimes it's interpersonal stuff, and sometimes you have a bunch of just like admin and sort of assessing people's work. It's very varied, I guess, which can be fun, but also sometimes it's a lot of context switching, I guess.
Yeah, it can be overwhelming.
No, exactly. And the thing is, I've heard such great things about Makers graduates. I normally get like a lot of great feedback. I definitely do want to touch on the kind of skills that, like, the best practices that you instill in new developers, and go through some of them. Like so do you want to go through like TDD, solid, stuff like that? So can you walk us through some best practices that you definitely like, that you normally teach these students?
I guess the two central, there's more to do, but I would say some of the central ones are TDD, so test-driven development, and also pairing. So they pretty much pair maybe half of the time, unless they're working in teams. Then they're working in a team, and maybe they're pairing within their teams as well. But usually, I guess their days are split between like individual work and pairing work, and so that, I guess, is already it's already supposed to help them develop these skills of sort of talking about what they're doing out loud, helping someone else, and learning from someone else, explaining what they've learned, because that helps them reinforce their learning and things like that. So I guess that's the purpose of pairing, but also like educationally, but also obviously many companies like to have their engineers pair. So that's also what.
It's a really important thing to get from the beginning. It's like, because from our bootcamp, we had homework sessions to do together, but the majority of it was individual work, right?
Yeah, exactly. And pairing can be quite a vulnerable thing when you're new. Because sometimes I remember, like, when I was pairing at the start, I was like feeling quite self-conscious about my coding ability, and someone's going to see like the way that I think, the way that I'm typing, and like
the typos,
like the syntax errors, the problem solving. But I think that, like, once you get over that kind of ego, like, and that like self-consciousness, it's so much easier to pair, and using that as like a great learning opportunity to see, like, to go through how you process problems, but also how other people do it as well. In some of my pairing sessions, like, I would pick up certain habits that they would do which weren't necessarily best practices. So can you talk about like some best practices like that you think that people should be implementing?
I think so. Test-driven development, I think, is pretty important for people that go through a boot. It's important. It's useful for everyone. I didn't used to do it before going to Makers.
I love test-driven development.
Wait, so test-driven development is when you test before you...
you write your test first, and it breaks, and then you go and write the logic that will make the test run.
Okay.
Yeah, and so the idea is, I guess, what could happen, I guess, is that you write the logic first, then you write a test that matches the logic that you've written, but it might not exactly be the logic you intended it to. Like, you might have written something else, and then your test passes, but you can't be sure whether it passes because you've just made it pass to match what you've written, or because it's really the logic you're intending, or the requirements, or it meets the requirements. So I guess the idea is, first you write the test, and you actually run the test, and you see it fail. Then you go and write this minimal amount of code to make that pass, that test case. And then you run the test, and hopefully it passes, or you go through that cycle until it passes. And then you go on, say, if it's a complex algorithm you're writing, your first test might just be, I don't know, one base case, or like one case of input, one type of input. Then maybe you write a second test case with another type of input, and then you write the logic that would make that input pass as well. rather than writing all of the logic at once and then trying to test it.
Okay, yeah. Because you were talking about edge cases last time, right?
Yeah, it can be really helpful to do it that way, I think, because you can then think through logically the different things that you want your code to do. Because otherwise you can miss those cases when you're writing the logic, right? And then the idea is if you've got all these test cases that you've written first and you've now made them pass, you can go back and edit and like kind of refactor your code to make it neater and cleaner and make sure that those changes you're making aren't going to break anything.
Yeah.
You've got those tests that you knew were working before. Whereas if you write the test afterwards, you might not know, like, it was working at some point. But,
yeah.
You know?
Where did it all go wrong?
Exactly.
And are you able, because you know me in the front end, but at least for the back end, are you able to see the test coverage? So if you've hit like 100%, because I know for Jest, we can normally see like the test coverage and where like we need to account for tests.
So I think it's a little bit more difficult to gather test coverage because like you use an automated tool to like calculate test coverage. I don't think it's always accurate for unit tests. I don't know what you think.
I think it can't be the only measure, I suppose, because you can cover lines without necessarily testing them well.
Ooh,
yeah,
that is such a good point.
Yeah.
So I'm just like, okay, I need to cover this, but you're right. I may not be testing for the right thing, even though technically the coverage is 100%.
Yeah. Exactly.
That's a good technique.
But if you're doing test-driven development, then you will have thought through those cases first and then match the logic to the cases. So you're less likely to have missed bits out.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's the other idea, I guess. What you could do if you write the logic first is that, and then you write some tests, you might not cover some of the lines that you've written.
Mm-hmm.
You're just like, yeah, okay, I've written a few tests.
Yeah.
Whereas if, like, I guess the reason it's called test driven is that the tests drive what logic you're writing. So you shouldn't ever be writing any extra logic that isn't required to make a test pass.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you take it to its extreme, it can get very, it can get a bit difficult, I think, to do in a bigger program.
Mm-hmm.
Or like if you have many different, a bigger system where you maybe don't quite know yet how exactly all of the classes, say you're using object-oriented code, like how all the classes will work together, which classes you'll have and stuff like that. Sometimes that's what I find hard with test-driven development, because I tend to kind of discover how I want to structure my code as I'm writing it.
Yeah.
So sometimes I have to do a bit of that first and then be like, okay, now I know I want like 3 classes and I roughly know what methods they'll have. So now I can start also writing the tests first. And then
No, that's a really important point, because you can definitely take it to the extreme, right? And it can be quite an opinionated thing as well. Some people can be very like die hard. You have to do TDD.
I know. Like, what is up with you people?
But there is like, I think there's a way to use it in balance where like sometimes if it's a really complicated piece of code that you're starting from scratch and it's interacting with a load of systems, you might need to map it out, the logic first. So yeah.
Let's talk about solid and dry and implementing that in our code.
Solid. Yeah, I think we used to have more about solid in the curriculum, but I don't think anyone can ever remember any of the OLID. People can remember the S, and I can remember the S, but then all the other ones are a bit like, okay, what exactly? Like, they're very abstract, I think. So the S is, see, can I remember it? It's separation of concerns, isn't it?
Single
responsibility principle, which is kind of, I always think of it as separation of concerns, which is something. So that one we do, that is the main thing, I guess, that we cover as part of object-oriented programming. So I guess you asked before, what are sort of the core practices? One of them is object-oriented programming, TDD pairing. And so for object-oriented programming, I guess, objects and classes are quite an abstract kind of thing. So that's kind of always a bit tricky to get people to grasp really what is a class. Like, because it's like, what is a class? It's like a blueprint and things like that. But then we kind of go through these exercises of, well, okay, how do you decide what should go in one class and what should go in another class? And that's where single responsibility principle comes in, where you think about like, okay, what are the responsibilities that each that exist in this I guess world that in the domain, I guess is the right word. So, for example, we'd start with user stories usually, and then there's one method where you might pick out the nouns and the verbs, which is not a foolproof method, but you could look at nouns tend to be either things that could be a class, or maybe they're like things that a class has. And then verbs often could be methods, but then the question is like which of the nouns is a class, and which methods belong to which nouns and things like that. So we try to kind of use methods like that to help people design class systems, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it's an important one to learn early on and it can be difficult. Like you said, it's difficult to grasp the concepts of like classes and kind of separation of concerns, but also it can be kind of opinionated too.
Yes.
So when you go into that first code base in your first role, you can see like, oh, I learned that we need to make sure we're following the solid design principles and keep everything separate. But I can see here that business logic is leaking into this class when it shouldn't. And so I think it's like, as important as it is to learn and understand the fundamentals, it's a good way also to spot where there isn't always the neatest code to follow. And like, I remember noticing that when I was joining, like, oh, I see not mistakes, but like ways that this could be improved or made easier to read. Because ultimately, like, for good code to be good code, although this is something I want to ask for your opinion on, it's not only do you want it to be performant and neat and clean, you also want it to be understandable and easy to maintain and build upon. And for that to be the case, you need that separation of concerns, right? How would you describe like good code or like good code?
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly what you said. I think that's one way you can motivate students to I guess care about separation of concerns, because that's the other thing. Is like especially with any students, really, like when you're trying to learn something, for some people it's more important than others, but in general it helps to know why am I doing this. So and they're kind of at the beginning used to just working on their, maybe in pairs, but still like they're not working in a big team of people. So they don't necessarily see like, well, this code in 10 weeks you won't understand it anymore, and also you would have this whole other group of people that will need to understand it.
There may be in a few months' time, if you're working on a big project, there may have been 4 or 5 people that have contributed to this file and changed what you wrote.
Oh my gosh, that happens. Yes. And you know what? That's what I was not prepared for when I joined my first role. Like, working on something and then I'll go back to it and it's gone and it's now been changed to something completely different. I think that a great thing about working with an actual code base is, like, for example, I would not have necessarily appreciated having reusable components when I'm doing my own personal projects. So it kind of introduces you to best practices, but within the industry, versus best practices that you can implement on a project that's quite small. And I think that's something that was really good to learn, and especially about testing. So when I was doing my projects, trust and believe, I didn't know testing was a thing in the front end.
We didn't learn about testing in our bootcamp.
We didn't learn about testing. And so when I'd see that on the Twitter threads, like the that they love to do a roadmap into like how to get your first developer job, and it felt like for backend there was a big emphasis on testing, but it wasn't that same emphasis when it came to the front end. So it was good to learn the job things about like just the difference between unit testing and doing end-to-end testing, and just the fact that like unit testing actually tests your components, but like end-to-end testing tests like how your components work amongst each other. So for example, you could test like a button component to see like the on-click function works, and it leads you to something else. But like in your end-to-end test, you'd see if that button leads you to this next page, or like you'd see the fact that within this form, for example, and you put in like certain elements, if you ask, I'm going on a tangent here.
No, that's okay.
No,
explain an end-to-end test. It makes sense.
Yeah. But it's just about like how your button component interacts with your form component, and making sure that they all work in sync the way you expect it to, which kind of like links to behavior-driven development, because you're testing the behavior of when you enter certain inputs into this form and you click create, is the API being called, and has it actually sent the details from your form into the post request, for example. So
I think if we were to summarize behavior-driven development, I think it's working together with a product manager to define a behavior and then building to that. And that's where the end-to-end test will kind of test that behavior, as opposed to a unit test, which is like a small measurement of a tiny part of the code base. It's like more holistic.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why like having good tickets is so important. So you know like the acceptance criteria, because you have to tick off like, what does this actually need to do? Like you can have a ticket could say create a form, but what inputs do you need to put on the form? Like that's why good tickets make such a big difference.
Yeah.
Well-defined tickets.
She sounds salty.
No.
I wonder who do you think should be writing tickets?
Oh, okay. All right. I'd love to hear your opinions on this, listeners, because I worked at 2 organizations that do tickets very differently.
Yeah.
So the first place that I worked, it was mostly on the developers. I wouldn't say I was working that closely with product managers. So we like in the ideation sessions when we're like planning for like the products that we're working on in different sprints, we'd see, for example, like the page that we need to build, and we'd break that up ourselves and write individual tickets, including the acceptance criteria.
So when you're refining, you're creating the acceptance criteria and you're delegating it amongst the team at that point?
No, it's more like the first part was just writing out the acceptance criteria and like breaking down the problems. It was mostly the developers that were actually breaking down the problem and coming up with the acceptance criteria. But at my second organization, it actually feels like the product manager has more involvement and is the one writing the tickets. But in refinement, it tends to be developers saying it, and I guess the product managers are writing it because we have the technical understanding of how to actually implement something.
Yeah.
And
so you're saying that there can be message lost in that translation?
I think that sometimes it's more challenging for, if a product manager isn't necessarily that technical, for them to understand the capabilities of either the front end or the back end, and how much the ticket needs to be split by, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. But I think that is coming back to behavior-driven development. That's the problem it's trying to solve, is like translating a non-technical requirement into something that then a developer will take away and build.
So who do you think should write tickets then?
Yeah, what's your opinion?
I don't know. I guess I've always been a back-end engineer. Or
shout out to back-end.
More of a back-end engineer. So I guess, I don't know whether that's common for back-end engineers or it's just how it's happened to me. In my work, I guess product managers tend to have been less involved anyway, because they're because I suppose most of the requirements that they care about are more the visual things or the general behavior of the app, say, at Memrise. And then for me, it would be like, okay, well, I'm discussing with the client engineers what kind of changes do we need to make for our API? Like, what should the API design be? And I'm thinking, like, what should the database table schema be? Or what,
So what is a client engineer?
Oh, by that I just mean the engineers that were at Memrise, that would be the engineers that worked on the Android and the iOS app.
Okay.
Or I guess front-end engineer.
Yeah. Okay, so you're working with the engineers who have already done their front-end part, or are you like doing it in parallel?
In parallel, I guess. Because sometimes they need a minimum from the back-end side.
Yeah.
Like, say, you have to agree on the API.
Get that, Amber? You have to agree.
Get me started on back end. The thing is, right, when you guys are doing your where's the documentation, people? That's what I need. We need to be absolutely clear about the acceptance. Anyway, let's not get into that.
We won't get into that argument, but I think sometimes front end need to have the responsibility of figuring out what they want.
And sometimes I think back end needs to have better documentation, so we know what to do for the post request and what we should be. The thing is, Postman is pretty good to know what we're getting back.
Yeah,
I don't need document, but what I need to send is something that I need to know.
Yeah, so mock it up for me.
Me?
Yeah,
you mock it up for me and do some documentation.
Okay, we'll end it there.
Yeah. So thank you so much for listening to part 1.
We've listened to Simo speak about how she's found her experience at Makers as a technical coach.
Spoke a bit about best practices like TDD, Solid, I don't think we've gotten to drive, but that's a whole other conversation.
Stay tuned for next week, where we'll be speaking to Simo about her career challenges as well as her tech tea.
Until then.
Available on all major podcast platforms.